In World War II, Britain had them, and so did the United States. So what were they? Why, traitors, of course. The nonconformists who, for various reasons, went to work for the enemy. One of the commonest forms of treason was broadcasting propaganda for the enemy, usually by radio. We British had the infamous Lord Haw-Haw, real name William Joyce, an American-born Irishman and pre-war British Union of Fascist propaganda chief who hot-footed it to Berlin in September 1939 on the outbreak of war to avoid arrest by the British police, and he broadcast Nazi propaganda to Britain in a sneering upper-class accent. He was hanged after the war by the British, even though he was really an American, a point that was deftly sidestepped by the prosecution at the time. In the Pacific Campaign, Tokyo Rose, a Japanese-American traitor, spouted Tojo propaganda to US GIs. Check out my recent video about her in the end screen. Well, one of the most infamous American traitors worked for Dr. Goebbels, earning her the nickname Axis Sally among Allied troops. Born in Portland, Maine in 1900, Mildred changed her surname to Gillars after her mother remarried in 1911. She was a student at Ohio Wesleyan University in 1918, studying appropriately dramatic arts, but never graduated. Determined to be an actress, she washed up next in Greenwich Village, New York, taking acting lessons and playing bit parts in stock theatre productions and vaudeville acts. She also worked as an artist model, but couldn't find anything substantial. In 1929, Gillars crossed the Atlantic and lived in Paris for 6 months, but nothing panned out, and she instead drifted back to New York City. In 1933, Gillars went to Algiers in North Africa, taking non-dramatic employment as a dressmaker's assistant within the large expatriate community in the French colony. And then, in 1934, Gillars turned up in Nazi Germany, studying music in Dresden, and then working as an English language teacher at a Berlitz school in Berlin. Once war broke out in September 1939, Gillars, as a US citizen, was of course unaffected, but her native language suddenly became quite valuable to her hosts. Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft, or German state radio, had special propaganda stations that beamed out pro-Nazi propaganda to the Allies, and native English speakers were very much prized. Gillars was recruited in 1940 and continued to work for German radio even when US citizens were warned by their embassy to leave Germany in late 1941, as it looked increasingly likely that the US was going to be dragged into World War II. Up to 1942, Gillars' broadcasts were fairly harmless, but then she was selected to front a new show called Home Sweet Home.
This is Berlin calling. And I'd just like to say that when Berlin calls, it pays to listen.
The show was deliberately designed to lower US morale by making GIs miss their homes and loved ones, and to doubt what they were doing in the war. Axis Sally was the nickname Gillars quickly acquired among her many thousands of listeners. There was another female broadcaster who was also sometimes known as Axis Sally during the war. Rita Zucker, an Italian-American, broadcast for the Germans on the Italian front from 1943 onwards. But Mildred Gillars is acknowledged generally as the Axis Sally. Gillars also fronted 3 other radio programs apart from Home Sweet Home. Midge at the Mic, broadcast in 1943, used familiar American songs of the era interspersed with Nazi propaganda, in particular anti-Jewish commentaries and attacks on President Roosevelt and the members of his government. More serious was GI's Letterbox and Medical Reports, both broadcast in 1944. These programs were beamed to the US home front directly, Gillars using information obtained from captured US servicemen to relay to their families, in particular wounded GIs in German captivity, the idea being to worry their families and lower morale at home.
Good evening, women of America. Well, you know, as time goes on, I think of you more and more. I can't somehow seem to get you out of my head. You women in America, waiting for the one you love, waiting and weeping in the secrecy of your own room, thinking of the husband, the son, or the brother who is being sacrificed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, perishing on the fringes of Europe.
Gillars even toured prisoner of war camps in 1943, interviewing captured GIs, the recordings used in her radio broadcasts against the soldiers' families. Gillars also had the opportunity to act, this time for a massive audience. In May 1944, she played an American mother who dreamed that her son was horribly killed aboard a ship in the English Channel during an invasion attempt on German-occupied France. Vision of Invasion was rather prescient, broadcast just 3 weeks before the actual D-Day invasion. As the Red Army closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Gillars continued to broadcast, and by now the FBI had a substantial file on her. Her broadcasts were defined as psychological warfare against the United States, but arresting Gillars would prove difficult. The FBI passed her case to the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, the U.S. Army's intelligence-gathering outfit, and the CIC would attempt to locate and arrest her once the war ended. Gillars left Berlin for a short period to continue her broadcasts, which were routed through Radio Hamburg. Her last program being broadcast on the 6th of May 1945, just 2 days before the war in Europe ended. But she soon drifted back to Berlin after British, American and French troops had arrived to take over their nation's respective occupation zones. This gave the CIC the opportunity to find and arrest her. Agents spoke to known friends and colleagues of Gillars in Berlin, and she had been seen in restaurants, beauty shops and stores in West Berlin. Cooperating with the Berlin police, CIC agents eventually discovered an antique shop where Gillars had stored a valuable piece of furniture. The owner gave up Gillars' address after some pressure. She was quickly apprehended and held in custody until December 1946. Released as the authorities needed more time to build a case against her, Gillars was rearrested in November 1947 and held by the U.S. Army until the 20th of August 1948, when she was flown to the United States to stand trial for treason. In early 1949, the Axis Sally trial opened. The most damning evidence against her were her recordings. GIs who had been prisoners of war said that Gillars passed herself off as a Red Cross worker when she toured the camps interviewing prisoners, gathering material for her broadcast to U.S. families. After a trial lasting 6 weeks, Gillars was found guilty and convicted of treason. She was sentenced to between 10 and 30 years in the Federal Women's Reformatory in West Virginia and also fined $10,000. Gillars served 10 years of her sentence before being paroled. She had converted to Roman Catholicism in prison, and after her release worked for the Our Lady of Bethlehem Convent in Columbus, Ohio, teaching German and French, and also music at St. George's Academy in the city. She also returned to university, gaining her degree, a Bachelor of Arts in Speech from Ohio Wesleyan. Mildred Gillars died of cancer in June 1988 at the age of 87 and was buried in St. Joseph's Cemetery in Columbus. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.